Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola, joined by my co-host, Rania Khalek. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And it's very great to have back on our show Steven Donziger, who's a human rights and environmental attorney. He's also a writer. He's been contributing columns to The Guardian, and he's out there engaged in activism. And we're very pleased to have him back on the show. Thanks for joining us, Steven.
Thanks for having me.
And we last crossed paths when you were at the Belmarsh Tribunal in Washington, D.C., and we were talking about freeing Julian Assange. But I think like a good place to start our show is we were going to have you on to talk about issues. I think the great thing about doing this episode with you is we don't only have to worry about you being under the gun here and facing prosecution and being put behind prison. The last time we caught up with you on the show, you were looking at going to prison. But before we get into the issues that you've been tracking and following, some of these stories, why don't you tell people what post-prison life has been like and some of what you've been up to since you were free and you're no longer on house detention or in prison.
Well, thank you for having me again. I love y'all's show, and I'm really love your work. So thank you for what you do. In a nutshell, for those who are new to this issue, I was targeted in the first corporate prosecution in U.S. history. I was essentially prosecuted for criminal contempt of court by Chevron, the big oil company, in the name of the U.S. government. And that happened after I had helped indigenous peoples in the Amazon win a historic pollution judgment against Chevron. I'm a lawyer. We won a $10 billion judgment, and they convinced down in Ecuador, and they convinced a U.S. judge to charge you with criminal contempt of court for litigating an issue, appealing an order from him that I turned my confidential case file over to Chevron, which was unprecedented and outrageous. And when I litigated that order, he essentially charged me with a crime. The case was rejected by the U.S. attorney. He appointed a private Chevron lawyer to prosecute me. It's unprecedented. I think it's a legal, clear violation of the rule of law. And then they used it as a pretext to detain me in my home for almost 3 years with an ankle bracelet. 6 weeks of that, I went to a federal prison and lived in a cell. In any event, that part of my, battle ended about a year ago, April of last year. And since then I've been free, but I want to emphasize I'm only partially free. They took my passport. I cannot leave the United States. I cannot, for example, travel to Ecuador where my clients live and help them by visiting them. They obviously don't have the resources to travel here. I can't do my human rights work in different countries around the world. So they've essentially hobbled my ability to be a full citizen of the United States and to enjoy, my basic rights. And on top of that, they have hit me with literally millions of dollars of court costs as a way to try to break me financially. Now, having said that, I want you guys to know I'm well. My wife, Laura Miller, and my son, Matthew, who's a junior in high school, we're good. Like, we're happy that I no longer have to wear an ankle bracelet and I could actually walk out of this apartment when I want. We're able to travel a bit around the United States. And I, of course, refuse to be silenced. And that's the point of their whole attack on me, is to shut me up. I refuse to be silenced, and I will continue to do my best to help those communities down in the Amazon hold Chevron accountable for their Amazon Chernobyl disaster in the Amazon, where they deliberately dumped billions and billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into the rainforest and resulting in the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So, that's where I want the focus to be, is on the people down there. I don't want them to keep using me as what I would call a weapon of mass distraction from their environmental crimes in Ecuador. But more broadly, I'm happy to be somewhat free. It's much better than being detained, but it's not fully what I need. And I'm going to continue to fight. And I am fighting. I'm about to file a petition, by the way, to the United Nations to rule against the U.S. government for letting its judiciary, deprive me of my liberty arbitrarily in violation of international law. So there's a lot going on, and I'm continuing to fight, but I'm really happy to be alive.
Well, we're happy that you're alive and that you are at least able to leave your home now and that you're not in a jail cell. But of course, like, I think your case also points to a theme that, given the topics we're going to discuss on this episode, it's prevalent among all these topics, which is the sort of corporate control that we see when it comes to government. When it comes to your case, like, there was so much corporate involvement of Chevron, of various law firms, like inside New York City and the state of New York, and all of these ways that were impacting the way you were being treated, to try to prevent Chevron from having to face like any level of accountability and just like punish you for your involvement in trying to get them to face accountability. And then I think I kind of want to segue from that theme into a recent piece you wrote for The Guardian, which is about another issue where there's just basically corporate control over government that's making it impossible to address, and that's the issue of climate change. And the title of your piece is Biden is still not doing nearly enough about the climate crisis. The president is trying to appeal to climate conscious young voters and appease the fossil fuel industry. It won't work. So why don't you give us an idea for those who are listening or watching? What is this piece about, and how would you relate it, if you can, I guess, to this theme that I just mentioned about corporate control over government?
That sounds like a law school essay question. I could probably write 20.
Yeah, I'm going to need a thesis. Yeah, give me a thesis, and then we'll have like a whole committee come and, challenge
you need
you
to
on it.
Get your PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, exactly. That is a great question, but I'll try to distill it down. I mean, basically, the piece in The Guardian is about how Biden, fashions himself as the climate president. He campaigned as the climate president, and he's completely gone back on his word. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that he's actually approved more oil and gas leases on federal lands than Donald Trump approved in the first 2 years of his presidency. The Intercept just wrote a story about how, the Biden administration has sold more weapons to the world's autocracies than the Trump administration ever did, military weapons. And sort of the common theme, I think, is that he really is transactional in trying to appease the corporate sector, the defense industry, the fossil fuel industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the railway industry. I mean, if you look at his decisions when he's really faced points that he could really assert his leadership in a positive way, he has completely flinched and backed down. One example is the railway strike that was about to happen, and he completely undercut the railway strike, which sort of related to the train derailment in Ohio, which has now created, what I believe is going to be over time a mass death event, with cancer-causing chemicals in the environment, and thousands of people being exposed right now in that part of the United States. So, and then in the fossil fuel side, just the other night, I was at a protest with Jane Fonda here in New York. He had a $25,000 plate fundraiser hosted by a former Blackstone executive, big Wall Street fundraiser here in New York. And like the majority of people in the room are heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, which is really taking our planet to the tipping point. So to sort of cover that up, the president is trying to sort of look good, so like he starts this Office of Environmental Justice in the White House. That's kind of what I wrote about in the article. But like it's cosmetic stuff, where when push comes to shove, when he really has a chance to lead on the climate issue and really on the democracy issue and on the issue of helping people, working people, he just never seems to get there. So let's not be deceived. We have two corporate dominated major political parties in the United States. One is really completely owned, I think, by the fossil fuel industry and the corporate sector. The other is heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by the same sector. And there's just not a lot of choice. So Biden, as a Democrat, his challenge is going to be to try to put out a bunch of, kind of nice looking ads and that kind of stuff to convince young people in particular, who are a key voting bloc, that he's a climate president, but he isn't. So we got to keep the pressure on.
Yeah. And can you speak to the specific projects that I know you've mentioned and are aware of? Can you tell people about the alarming Willow project, this Alaska LNG project in Alaska as well? And maybe you have a comment on since you've represented indigenous people in Ecuador, maybe you have a comment on what this White House has done, which I think is kind of disgusting, in making Deb Haaland the face of, having to go out there and sell this Willow project to people as the Interior Secretary, putting her in this position that she really shouldn't have to be in.
Yeah, that's awful. So, there's three main things Biden has done that completely violate his campaign promise not to let more drilling happen on federal lands. I mean, one is the Willow Project in Alaska, which alone is a 30-year project, billions and billions of dollars. ConocoPhillips it's their project. And ultimately, it's going to create more emissions than any savings on emissions that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act is going to produce for America, for the United States. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Now, I actually think, I'm not totally sure it's going to happen. There's legal battles going on around it, and we have to keep fighting. It's not a certainty it will happen, but the fact Biden approved it is awful. And there's a second project, a liquefied natural gas project, also in Alaska, another $40 billion project, same problem. And then he approved the auction of an area of the Gulf of Mexico for oil and gas larger than the size of the country of Italy. Okay, think about that. And by the way, he's doing that when there's I'm so into the details, it drives me crazy. I apologize to everyone watching, but I just want to mention this fact. There are 14,000 unplugged old oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico that will cost tens of billions of dollars to clean. Many of them are leaking into the Gulf. And the companies that built 90% of them are the super majors, including, Chevron and Exxon and BP and Shell. They just grift. They just abandon these wells. They're obligated to clean them up, and they don't. So the president, Biden, is approving an expansion of oil and gas in the Gulf. At the same time, the companies that are going to take advantage of this auction for these leases are not even cleaning up the mess that they left behind. I mean, the whole thing is an abomination. You see this over and over. I mean, that's what the case I've been working on in Ecuador against Chevron. I mean, Chevron went into Ecuador, literally dumped 16 billion gallons of cancer-causing waste over a 25-year period. They did it by design. It was part of their engineering design of how they drilled in this formerly pristine area of the Amazon. And then, at the end of their, contractual lease agreement with the government of Ecuador, they just fled the country. They gave them $40 million to clean up when the actual cleanup costs are probably $20 billion. And they grift, so they basically and this is happening in the United States too, in California, the Gulf of Mexico. They basically take the profits out and leave taxpayers to bail them out in terms of cleaning up the mess that they cause. The whole industry is, in my opinion, completely unethical in the way it operates, even if you assume it should legitimately operate, given that it's also destroying the planet. So I think it's an outrage, frankly, that Biden, as the leader of this very powerful, wealthy country, the United States of America, cannot at a minimum appoint a commission to come up with a game plan to phase out this industry. I mean, it could be 10, 20, 30, 50 years. We have no plan. I mean, the guy just lurches from one oil and gas lease to another while the planet is burning. I mean, one thing I noticed, and I wrote about in my column, a study just came out about the climate impacts from global warming in Africa. And there were 43,000 attributable excess deaths in one country, in Somalia. Half of the deaths being children under 5 because of drought and a lack of rainfall directly related to the climate changes being produced by fossil fuel pollution. Like, literally hundreds of thousands of people now are dying every year on the planet. Like, this is happening now. We're in crisis. And he's going around to these, $25,000 plate fundraisers from fossil fuel investors and approving oil and gas leases with no plan to phase out the industry. And I think it's extremely irresponsible, and it concerns me greatly just as a human being on this planet. It's awful.
Yeah, I mean, it is horrible. Then you put that together with some other issues that have been taking place under this particular administration, but are just kind of always chugging along in the US. And I chose my words wisely there because I wanted to just bring up the Ohio train derailment, which is kind of like a mix of infrastructure like going wrong because of corporate neglect, as well as contributing to climate change as well. But there, that train derailment happened. There was zero accountability for the company that was involved. I don't even think Biden ever went and visited the area after it took place and like poisoned everyone's water. And then I was so shocked to learn that like this happens 1,000 times a year or some crazy number like that. There's a lot of train derailments in the US. I'm just curious if you had anything to add about that particular issue.
Well, look, the Ohio train derailment is illustrative of a deep problem in the United States, which is a complete lack of governmental oversight over corporate behavior, over all sorts of industries, fossil fuel industry, as we see, with the example in the Gulf of Mexico, the railway industry. I mean, essentially, the United States, through a series of decisions or lack of decisions, basically we're letting these rail companies transport the most dangerous chemicals on Earth using a braking system that was invented in the 1800s. I mean, basically, that was because of a lack of government oversight, because the railway industry had essentially bought out Congress and bought out legislation. And that, in turn, in my opinion, led to the derailment. And then once the derailment happened, where was the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency? They didn't show up. I mean, they basically let the company, the polluter, this case Norfolk Southern Rail, make a unilateral decision to detonate chemicals in a giant fireball that is guaranteed to create a cancer zone for the next several decades. It's going to affect tens of thousands of people. I mean, the company made that decision. The EPA didn't make that decision, but the EPA, our government, let the company make that decision. So a lot of what you're seeing in Ohio, a lot of the chemical fires, there was just a big one in Houston, the unplugged gas wells, these pollution problems that are manifesting all over the country are, I think, directly related to a lack of government oversight, which is directly related to the power of money to essentially buy out government, which is directly related to the takeover of our federal judiciary to produce decisions like Citizens United, which essentially allows unlimited flow of money into our politics and into our judiciary. And, I was a victim of that too, because I don't think they could have gotten away with a private corporate prosecution 20, 30 years ago, before the Leonard Leo Koch brothers funding network essentially took control of the pipeline of who could become a federal judge and took control of the Supreme Court. I don't think that, Chevron could have gotten away with a direct corporate prosecution of their lawyer adversary, before Leonard Leo and the Koch brothers had essentially created a funding network to take control of our Supreme Court. My case was before the U.S. Supreme Court as recently as, 6 weeks ago. And, they didn't act on it. And, then you find out that the court keeps a charity, that allows litigants with cases before the justices to donate to this Supreme Court charity. And Chevron had been giving them about $200,000 a year while they were litigating against me before the Supreme Court. I mean, everything is, even if you have an issue with the idea of liberal democracy in the United States, like if we're going to have it, at least that piece of it should function
right,
properly and without corruption, right? But like they've even, liberal democracy is essentially, corporate style democracy, and there's some benefits to that, right? There's usually political space. You can get to court. Ideally, the judges are going to be fair as they litigate battles between commercial giants or human rights guys like me. But like, even that has been, I think, extremely corrupted by corporate money. And I think I'm a victim of that. I think the people of Ecuador are a victim of that. The people of East Palestine, Ohio, who are, being exposed to these toxins are victims of that. I mean, it's happening all over the country. And it really stems from a lack of government oversight. And I would say the corporate buyout of the regulatory function of government.
And Steven,
I'm sorry,
I know that
I'm not laying too much on. Let me explain. I'm actually an eternal optimist. You're probably listening like, oh my God, like where do we go from here? I get it. We are in a difficult situation, but you know what? We have the numbers, we have the power, we have the vision, and the key is to stay on our game and not be distracted by all this what appears to be crazy stuff happening in the United States. I mean, mass shootings and all these abortion questions and kicking out transgender legislators to silence them. And, there's a whole lot of crazy going on in the United States right now. There really is. And I don't blame people if it's like depressing and demoralizing. But what I want to say is this: don't get distracted, okay, by the crazy, because it's all part of the plan. They want people to be completely distracted. I mean, the corporate sector, by these hot button cultural issues, guns, abortion, that kind of thing. So they don't focus on the economics, which is essentially that we just run a country where there's mass numbers of people living in poverty. We still have no healthcare plan that covers everybody. We're in the wealthiest nation on earth. We people can't even make a living wage. I mean, there is a major fleecing going on of working people in the United States, and all of these hot button issues that the corporate media tends to focus on. They matter. Abortion matters, reproductive, those are important issues, but you got to be careful to put them in their proper place to not get distracted by some other economic issues that are really helping the corporate sector control our society, control our freedoms. It's all connected. We cannot get demoralized, depressed, or distracted by what appears to be a lot of crazy.
Yeah, and thank you for articulating that. I want to ask you about the StopCopCity movement that I know you went to visit in Atlanta. And I think you could argue that this is a reason to have hope, because there are a lot of people who have mobilized. I think they've been effective. And I know that they've been effective because of the backlash that they have faced for speaking out and standing up and organizing, particularly these people who entered the forest area to stop this cop compound that the Atlanta city wants to build for not just police in the area, but it would be a facility that I understand police forces throughout the U.S. might be able to take advantage of if they wanted to send people there to train. And the biggest thing is that you would be doing deforestation of an area that is in one of the remaining belts of forest that could really help the South deal with climate change. I know that's been an argument of people who have organized, but I want to turn your attention to two things. And this will basically be kind of I know you'll probably have a long answer to this, but I want to get this into our show before we have to wrap. So first, to note that Manuel Turan, or Tortuguita, was what he was known by, this environmental defender who we now know from the autopsy was shot 57 times by a cop. And I know you've dealt with environmental defenders in the context of the Amazon rainforest who have been under attack. So you can approach that question. And then the second part of my question to you is just to raise this National Lawyers Guild letter that was just written. I imagine this is happening to a number of people, but I want to mention this case. Tortuguita has gotten some attention. Less attention is to the people who have been hit with these domestic terrorism charges for going to these protests and now are facing these life-altering consequences that could destroy their ability to pursue any career. I don't know if you know this, Steven, but the National Lawyers Guild wrote a letter to the chancellor of the University of North Carolina because a law student at the University of North Carolina named Jamie Marsicano has been basically told that they are not allowed to attend their classes. And that's because they attended it was a music festival that was put on in Atlanta in March as part of the organizing to challenge the construction of this cap city. And so, it's not clear that they'll be able to finish their semester, and it's not clear that they'll be allowed to return to in-person classes to graduate. And this is because they've been charged with domestic terrorism offenses in Georgia, which are highly political. And yet this university is going along with what Georgia is doing to these younger people who are taking great risk. So I'll let you can say whatever you want to both of those issues.
Well, I'm glad you raised this. I know Jamie's case very well. I've talked to Jamie on a number of occasions, and I'm try to write something about that. But let me just say this. There are 42 people now who are mostly peaceful protesters charged with domestic terrorism in Atlanta as a pure, what I would call illegal deprivation of their constitutional rights. It is a pure political play by the governor of Georgia and his allies in the police, law enforcement, and in the political world. I mean, what's going on in Georgia is really scary. I would advise anyone around the world in the United States, if you actually are progressive, not to travel to Georgia. It's a place where they easily arrest people who speak out against this police training complex or anything related to law enforcement for no reason. And in Jamie's case, Jamie was at a music festival in the Cop City area. He was peacefully protesting. He was on public parkland. He committed no crime. Now, maybe they would argue, well, he's trespassing because it was near where they were going to plan to build Cop City. At worst, misdemeanor trespassing. No one's ever put in jail for that. Jamie and many others in the same situation are now facing 35-year prison sentences as terrorists. And the law on its face, I believe, as written by the Georgia, authorities, is unconstitutional. But the larger issue is it doesn't really matter to them because they're using the law as a weapon of intimidation to lock people up without trial, because there's so much that can happen in the procedure of a court case, in a criminal case, to punish people, to impose suffering without getting a conviction. Like, I actually believe Jamie's case and these other cases are going to fall apart with time, but it doesn't matter because many of them have been in these awful jails in Atlanta for months. Others spent weeks. They were finally bonded out, like Jamie, who has to wear an ankle bracelet and can't even go to class. And Jamie is a brilliant student and a hero, and his classmates at University of North Carolina love him. And I think it's a damn outrage that a university, any university, particularly a flagship state university like the one in North Carolina, would deny a student his or her due process rights based on a completely false allegation that has never been tested in court. I mean, it's just an outrage. And I'm glad you told me about that. I didn't know about the Guild letter. I'd love it if you could get it to me. I want to read that. But people need to pay attention to Jamie's case. It's illustrative of what's happening to 42 people right now who the police are they're basically trying to destroy their lives to quash what has become a historic protest movement. That what's going on in Atlanta to block this police training academy they're trying to build there costs $90 million. $60 million of the money is coming from corporations. This is the nexus between corporations, police repression, and climate activism, because they want to build it in an indigenous forest, the Weilani Forest. I visited there recently. It's an incredibly beautiful forest. And so they want to raise the last green canopy in the Atlanta area to build a training complex to train police in urban warfare tactics are going to be turned on mostly minority urban communities. That is more police repression. And the whole thing brings together these movements, and it's really important. And the people who've been living in the forest and so far have been very successful in blocking construction of this completely misguided idea of a training academy. I think I respect them so much. It's inspirational. I've always said, and I said this the other day when I was speaking at the Biden rally here in New York, I mean, the stronger the climate movement becomes, or the stronger the labor movement becomes, or the stronger, the movement to stop police repression becomes, the more vicious the other side becomes in response. And we need to be prepared for this. And that is what's happening in Georgia. And I think it's just unbelievable that the Democratic Party, and the senators in Georgia, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, have yet to speak out against not only Cop City. I mean, you can even agree with Cop City, but at least speak out against the idea that peaceful protesters are being charged with terrorism. Complete abuse of the law, complete abuse of their power. And I think that the criminal conspiracy that's going on in Georgia is one involving the police, prosecutors, and judges who are trying to, thwart a legitimate protest movement protected by our Constitution. That's the criminal conspiracy. So people need to pay attention to Georgia. I'll also say for the international listeners, Tortuguita is the first U.S. Climate activist in the modern era murdered by police. The last 10 years, Global Witness has documented over 1,700 people assassinated around the world for doing environmental justice work, and mostly in Latin America, Africa. We now have that happening in the United States, and people need to understand that this country has crossed the Rubicon. A lot of people, I don't know about your listeners, but a lot of people around the world think like we got it right here. We have the rule of law, and our justice system is free of corruption, and we work better than systems in many other countries. And what's happening now is it's turning out not to really be true. If you look at my private corporate prosecution, look at the police killing of Tort, you look at a lot of other things, the ethics problems in our judiciary with Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court justice. There's so many issues now that really raise the broader issue of, does the United States really live under the rule of law? And, I don't want to condemn our whole system because it depends, right? Where and the circumstances. Some states and some judiciaries are better than others. But we are noticing trends in this country right now that are extremely concerning and that really take the United States out of the category. Not that it ever deserved to be there, but many people believe it deserved to be there. Of some sort of exceptional judiciary where the rule of law prevails. I don't think you can say that anymore. And I think what's happening to Tort is yet another example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it doesn't sound, it sounds like another version of what you had to endure in many ways in terms of like the way you're talking about the sort of level of corruption in the city and the state with those in the positions of authority in the judiciary and the police and targeting these activists. But like, is this a new precedent though? Like targeting activists as terrorists? Has this happened before? Is this like something that now that it's set in Georgia, if it isn't challenged, could be something that we see in other parts of the country? Like how serious is this?
I watched these cases very closely. Let me just give you the basic facts. Before Georgia, there were only 2 people and climate activists charged with terrorism in the United States. One, Jessica Resnicek, she vandalized a pipeline. She's a climate warrior, vandalized a pipeline. Nobody got hurt, and she got hit with an 8-year sentence because they gave her a terrorist enhancement. Because there's this whole movement by the fossil fuel industry to try to, get states and the federal government to impose draconian penalties if someone protests at an oil installation, as if it's some special category of property, that if you go to those places versus like say a Walmart, you're somehow a terrorist and you have to go to jail for 10 years versus just getting hit with a misdemeanor trespassing charge like what happened at a Walmart, So there's this whole movement by the industry to criminalize any kind of activism if it takes place in the context of the oil industry. And what's happening in Georgia is that's now being extended to any kind of activism against police, against a police academy. And, none of these people are terrorists. I mean, any reasonable terrorism. What is terrorism? I mean, terrorism is about, creating some violent act that is designed to instill mass fear in the civilian population to achieve some aim. None of these people committed a single act of violence. I mean, they're basically at worst are guilty of crimes of property damage. So the idea in Atlanta, most of them never did a damn thing. I mean, they were just at a music festival, So the idea that we are now calling people exercising their free speech rights in the United States, terrorists, is really a terrible threat to our freedom in this country. And it is designed, I think, to intimidate people and to shrink the space that the climate movement needs to accomplish its objectives, which is to phase out fossil fuels so we can save the planet. It's all connected. It really is. These terrorist laws are designed to, I think, protect the profits of mostly the fossil fuel industry, but also other industries that are destroying the planet or poisoning the air and the water, like the rail company in Ohio, in Norfolk Southern. So, we need to understand that this isn't just about protest. It is connected to larger pieces of a strategy that are designed to protect corporate profits at the expense of public safety and the expense of freedom, and yeah, it happened to me. I think back, like they started attacking me in 2011, like ferociously, when I got sued for $60 billion. I got sued for the most money of anyone in US history by Chevron. And I think if they if this sort of happened today, I mean, they'd probably try to figure out some way to get me charged with terrorism. I don't know, because basically my whole work was designed to hold an oil company accountable for its pollution. But yeah, it involved actions at oil installations, that Chevron had an interest in the Amazon. So, I mean, who knows what would have happened? I mean, I think I was kind of a lab experiment for the industry to see what they could get away with in terms of the manipulation of the judiciary. And I do think what happened to me, and especially I would say the weakness of our Supreme Court in not taking my case to overturn my private corporate prosecution. So those are now legal. Corporate prosecutions are now legal through my case in the United States. The cowardice of the judiciary, the weakness of the judiciary to not uphold the rule of law in the face of these corporate generated legal attacks, weaponization of the law by police, by prosecutors, and by industry to silence people like me and like you guys and like the people I was protesting with the other day. That's a key issue in the United States. And, people need to wake up. Like, this isn't just about Atlanta, okay? It's not just about Steve Donziger, okay? It is happening all over the place. So we've gone essentially from 2 or 3 people to now almost 50 people charged with domestic terrorism in a matter of 8 months.
If I can tie this all together as we wind down our conversation, you have the United Nations report on climate change, which presents what is really at stake here. What lies ahead of us if we can't control the fossil fuel boom. And I know that's a central part of what you're writing and that's in your mind when you're out there joining Jane Fonda to consider civil disobedience, going to these events, traveling around, talking to these activists, providing your own legal support, your own solidarity for what these younger people are doing to risk their lives. But I want to ask you, because I think this might be, you're pulling on the mythology that we have in this country around how great we have it as Americans. So I feel like this is a good last question for you, which is to say, a lot of people really have this faith that the law is going to work things out, that you can go to court. There are quite a number of environmental attorneys and environmental firms that do good. I think I'm glad that they're out there challenging what these corporate institutions are doing to degrade our lands, to ruin our access to water and everything. And they're doing admirable work. I wouldn't tell them to quit. But what I do think we should be mindful of is this fact that, like, there really does seem like we need something alternative, because as your case shows, and as what we're seeing in other parts of our country, the courts really aren't going to save us and ensure that the fossil fuel industry doesn't make our planet inhabitable.
Well, let me just say this. I think one big change I've noticed in my lifetime, and I'm probably considerably older than you guys, okay? So I've been sort of watching this show for 40 years as an adult. And I'd say the most fundamental change in that 40 years is when I was younger, there was like at least some effort by the government to protect the public from corporate power. Okay. Now, government has become yet another instrument of corporate power. Okay, that is a fundamental change in the United States of America. If you go back to the 70s when Ralph Nader and others were leading the way with the EPA, the Consumer Protection Bureau, and all the things that were happening to protect people, okay, through government, it was a different kind of feel. And that was before the corporate sector led by the Koch brothers and the Powell memo. By the way, I'm not crazy. All of this is documented by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse in his new book called The Scheme, which I recommend to everybody. Go read The Scheme and you'll understand how this went down for the last 40 years, where the money came from and how they essentially took over government, including the judiciary. Okay, so I'm not making this up. Because of these changes that sort of created a more fair regulatory environment in the United States, the corporate sector came up with what's turned out to be a 40, 50-year plan to essentially take over government. So government could no longer do its job of protecting the public. And that is the one fundamental change that I think has most negatively impacted our world and our society. And it's the reason why we have so many of these problems. Now, I want to say this, and Pat, and before I go, what do we do? Okay. First of all, there's so much we can do. Okay. You know, the fact is they don't completely control the judiciary. They don't. I mean, there's a ton of good judges. There's a ton of ways to bring cases, and these cases are happening. And the other thing is, you know, even the Supreme Court is limited by its own need to have legitimacy. I mean, they're not going to just do whatever they want. And if we build movement strong enough at the grassroots level, and, you know, take over the political space to the extent we can and run candidates and take advantage of whatever is left of our liberal democracy so we can strengthen, you know, these very important, the climate movement and the workers movement, the labor movement, we can get back the United States to a place where it has at least a modicum of fairness. So, you know, I'm an eternal optimist. You know, I've never met an attack on me that I did not see as some sort of opportunity. I really mean that. Like when Chevron went after me, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to keep talking and try to turn it around. And I think for the most part, even though I felt a lot of pain, as did my wife and son, I think we have turned it around. Like people don't believe Chevron anymore in the sort of the clash between Chevron and me for the most part. Right. So we can build off of their attacks. You just have to be smart about it. And people also need to decolonize the information system. What do I mean by that? Like, take your education into your own hands, you know, get information from independent sources like you folks or independent podcasters. You know, if you're relying on the New York Times and the corporate media exclusively for your information, you're not going to get there. You know, so what I do every day is I look for information, takes a little time, that's accurate, you know, that gives a perspective that you're not going to see in the mainstream United States media. I'm not saying don't read the mainstream media. I read that too, because there is some decent information now and again. I also like to see how they're curating the narrative, right? But like, we need to take our education into our own hands, keep learning and keep acting and get connected to grassroots movements to sort of take back the space we need in this country to create a more just society. Like, I'm not going to say it's going to happen anytime soon, but my friends, we have no choice. Like, we have to engage in organizing and activism. There's no choice. Too much is at stake. And I believe we can succeed with enough organizational capacity.
All right, Steven, thank you for joining our show. Is there someplace people can go? I think do you have a Substack now that people can read? Right?
I do. I'm sort of writing on Substack. I'm writing for The Guardian, and I have a website called freedonziger.com. The reason I call it that is because, again, I'm not completely free. I can't travel, and I no longer have my law license, and I'm fighting to get those back. By the way, I have a defense fund. I don't have any bank accounts because Chevron took all my money. I mean, this is honest.
So I'm not laughing. That's not funny to laugh about. It's just like,
so,
wow.
Yeah, I have to pay lawyers and, you know, live with our basic expenses. So if people want to help, go to freedonziger.com, sign up. You can also donate. Any contribution is appreciated, no matter how small. But more importantly, join our campaign, and you'll get regular informational updates about what I'm dealing with. And, it's not just me, not just Ecuador, although that's critical to my work. We're talking about a lot of important human rights issues in the United States and around the world as well. So come join us. It's we're moving.
Well, excellent, Steven. Well, we have to go, but it's been great talking with you. And
I
everyone,
love you
thank
guys.
you for
Keep up the great
tuning
work.
in.
I really appreciate you having me. I mean, information, I'm telling people, well, they're already watching you, so I probably don't need to tell them to come watch you, but spread the word about Kevin and Rania. This is an important show, and I appreciate your having me on.